Hey there, weary travelers of the digital realm. Tonight we venture into the shadowed corridors of ancient China, where absolute power corrupted absolutely, and where the sons of heaven lived lives that would make modern scandals seem quaint by comparison. Before you settle into your pillow and let the weight of the day slip away, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you find solace in these nocturnal journeys through history's darker chapters. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? Perhaps you're tucked away in a cozy apartment as rain patters against the windows, or maybe you're watching the first light of dawn creep across your bedroom wall. Wherever you are, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend this quiet hour with me. Now, dim those lights. Maybe let a gentle fan hum in the background and prepare yourself for a tale that spans millennia. Tonight, we're not just exploring history. We're peeling back the silk curtains of the Forbidden City to reveal what really happened when mortals declared themselves gods on Earth. When you think of ancient China, your mind might drift to serene gardens, wise philosophers, and elegant calligraphy. But behind the porcelain facade of imperial splendor lurked a world of breathtaking cruelty, bizarre obsessions, and psychological torments that would haunt dynasties for thousands of years. The Chinese emperors didn't just rule an empire, they ruled a civilization that stretched across vast continents, commanding the lives and deaths of hundreds of millions of souls. These weren't mere kings or tribal chiefs. They were the sons of heaven, divine beings who claimed their authority came directly from the celestial realm. Their word was law, their whims were policy, and their madness became the nightmare of entire generations. From the blood-soaked origins of the first unified empire to the decadent final gasps of imperial power, the throne of China was a seat that corrupted even the most promising souls who dared to claim it. But these weren't just ancient cautionary tales. These were real men, flesh and blood, who wielded power over one of humanity's greatest civilizations. Their decisions shaped the destiny of billions. Their obsessions carved scars across the landscape that remain visible today. And their legacy continues to whisper through the corridors of power even now. The year was 259 BCE. And in the warring state of Qin, a child was born who would one day reshape the known world through sheer brutality and unbending will. His birth name was Ying Zheng, but history would remember him by a title that still sends shivers down the spine: Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. Picture, if you will, a land torn apart by centuries of warfare. 7 major kingdoms battled endlessly for supremacy, while smaller states were swallowed up like minnows by sharks. It was an age of iron and blood, where survival meant either conquering or being conquered. Into this chaos stepped a young man whose vision was as terrifying as it was ambitious. He didn't just want to win the war. He wanted to erase the very concept of multiple kingdoms from existence. Qin Shi Huang ascended to the throne of Qin at the age of 13. But the real power lay in the hands of his regent and the court officials who surrounded him. Yet even as a teenager, whispers followed him through the palace corridors. Some said he was the illegitimate son of a merchant. Others claimed his mother had been involved in scandalous affairs that cast doubt on his royal bloodline. These rumors would haunt him throughout his life, feeding a paranoia that would eventually consume his soul. By the time he reached adulthood, Qin Shi Huang had transformed from a questioned heir into a military genius with an iron will and an absolute intolerance for opposition. His armies swept across China like a plague, methodically crushing each rival kingdom with devastating efficiency. But this wasn't mere conquest. It was systematic annihilation of everything that had come before. When he finally achieved what no man before him had accomplished, unifying all of China under a single ruler, Qin Shi Huang didn't simply declare victory and retire to enjoy his spoils. Instead, he embarked on a project of social engineering so radical and brutal that it would make modern dictators pale in comparison. He ordered the destruction of all regional identities, local customs, and traditional ways of life. Different currencies, different writing systems, different measurements, all were swept away and replaced with standardized imperial versions. But perhaps most chilling of all was his treatment of intellectual opposition. When Confucian scholars dared to criticize his methods and suggest that perhaps the old ways had some merit, Qin Shi Huang's response was swift and merciless. He ordered what became known as the burning of books, where countless volumes of ancient wisdom, poetry, and historical records were tossed into massive bonfires that burned for days. The smoke that rose from those flames carried with it thousands of years of accumulated human knowledge. Yet even this wasn't enough to satisfy his rage. The scholars who had dared to oppose him faced a fate that was whispered about in terrified tones throughout the empire. Qin Shi Huang ordered 460 of them to be buried alive, thrown into pits while still breathing and covered with earth. As they screamed and clawed at the soil above them, the first emperor reportedly watched with cold satisfaction. This wasn't just execution, it was a message written in human suffering. The emperor's paranoia extended far beyond political opponents. He became obsessed with assassination attempts, real and imagined. His sleeping arrangements became an elaborate security theater, with multiple bedrooms prepared each night, so that no one, not even his most trusted servants, would know where he actually rested his head. He would change his route through the palace randomly, arrive at meetings unexpectedly, and trust no one completely. This psychological torment wasn't limited to his enemies. Even his own family lived in constant fear of his unpredictable moods. Court officials learned to read the subtle signs of his displeasure, knowing that a misplaced word or an unfortunate expression could mean not just their own death, but the extermination of their entire family line. The palace became a place where people spoke in whispers and walked on silk slippers, terrified that even their footsteps might offend the divine ruler. As Qin Shi Huang aged, his paranoia transformed into something even more disturbing, an obsession with immortality that would consume the final years of his reign. Having conquered the known world, he now sought to conquer death itself. He dispatched expeditions to seek the elixir of life, sent ships filled with young men and women to mysterious islands where immortals supposedly dwelled, and consumed increasingly dangerous potions prepared by court alchemists. These alchemists, desperate to please their terrifying master, fed him concoctions containing mercury, believing it would grant him eternal life. Instead, the heavy metals slowly poisoned his system, contributing to mood swings that grew ever more violent and erratic. Palace servants learned to avoid him during certain hours, when the mercury-induced rage would overtake him, turning the Son of Heaven into a frothing, paranoid monster who saw enemies in every shadow. The irony of his quest for immortality was lost on no one except the emperor himself. Here was a man who had built his empire on the bones of millions, who had buried scholars alive and burned libraries to ash, now desperately seeking to avoid the very fate he had inflicted on countless others. Death, it seemed, was the one enemy that refused to bow before his imperial authority. His construction projects during this period reflected his growing megalomania. The Great Wall, while impressive to modern eyes, was built with the forced labor of millions of peasants, soldiers, and prisoners. Conservative estimates suggest that over 1 million people died during its construction, their bodies literally built into the foundation of what would become one of the world's most famous landmarks. Workers who collapsed from exhaustion were simply buried where they fell, their bones becoming part of the mortar that held the stones together. But the wall was just one of many monuments to his vanity. His tomb, which he began constructing shortly after taking power, was an underground palace designed to house him in the afterlife. Thousands of craftsmen and laborers worked for decades to create a subterranean empire complete with rivers of mercury, mechanical crossbows designed to kill intruders, and an army of terracotta warriors to serve him in death. The construction of this tomb reveals perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his character. According to historical records, when the tomb was finally completed, all the craftsmen who had worked on its inner chambers were sealed inside alive, ensuring that its secrets would die with them. Even in death, Qin Shi Huang couldn't bear the thought that others might know something he didn't want revealed. As his health declined, likely hastened by the mercury poisoning from his immortality elixirs, the emperor's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would fly into rages over minor infractions, order executions for imagined slights, and spend hours staring at maps of his empire as if trying to memorize every detail before his inevitable departure from the world. When death finally came for the first emperor in 210 BCE, it found him not in his palace surrounded by loved ones, but on a journey far from the capital, desperately seeking yet another rumored source of immortality. The man who had conquered death for millions couldn't escape it himself. His body, already ravaged by mercury poisoning and the stress of absolute power, simply gave out. But even his death became a source of palace intrigue and horror. His chief eunuch and closest advisor, Li Si, along with the ambitious general Zhao Gao, conspired to hide the emperor's death until they could manipulate the succession to their advantage. For months, they kept up the pretense that Qin Shi Huang was still alive, bringing meals to his carriage and issuing orders in his name while his corpse slowly decomposed in the summer heat. The smell became so overwhelming that they were forced to transport cartloads of rotting fish alongside the imperial carriage to mask the stench of their dead emperor. It was a fitting end for a man whose reign had been marked by the scent of burning books and buried scholars. His own death hidden beneath the reek of decaying fish. When the deception was finally revealed, the empire that Qin Shi Huang had built through terror and brutality began to crumble almost immediately. His chosen heir was murdered, his dynasty collapsed within years, and the unified China he had created through such horrific means fragmented once again into warring factions. Yet his legacy lived on, not in the monuments he built or the lands he conquered, but in the template he created for absolute power. Future Chinese emperors would look to his reign as both inspiration and warning, seeing in his rise the potential for unlimited authority, and in his fall the dangers of unchecked paranoia and cruelty. The first emperor had indeed achieved a form of immortality, but not the kind he had desperately sought. Instead of living forever, he became an eternal symbol of how power corrupts, how paranoia destroys, and how even the mightiest rulers are ultimately just mortal men playing at being gods. As we drift deeper into this dark history, we'll see how the pattern Qin Shi Huang established, this cycle of absolute power breeding absolute corruption, would repeat itself across the centuries that followed. Each new dynasty would promise reform and benevolence, only to succumb to the same temptations that had consumed the first emperor. But that is a tale for the next part of our journey, as we explore how the Han Dynasty rose from the ashes of Qin brutality, only to develop its own disturbing traditions of imperial excess and cruelty. The collapse of the Qin dynasty unleashed chaos across China, but from that chaos emerged a new imperial line that would prove even more enduring and, in many ways, more disturbing than what had come before. The Han Dynasty, which would rule for over 4 centuries, began with a peasant rebel named Liu Bang, who fought his way to the dragon throne through cunning, betrayal, and rivers of blood. Liu Bang, who would become Emperor Gaozu, was everything the refined court officials despised. A crude, uneducated man who had once been a minor village official, he possessed a peasant's understanding of survival and a bandit's approach to power. When he finally defeated his rivals and established the Han Dynasty in 206 BCE, the educated elite expected him to fade into obscurity like so many other upstart warlords. Instead, he proved to be one of the most ruthlessly effective rulers in Chinese history. But his methods were far from noble. Gaozu understood that in the aftermath of Qin's brutal unification, the people craved stability above all else. He gave them that stability, but at a price that would echo through centuries of imperial rule. The new emperor's first priority was eliminating potential threats, and he approached this task with methodical cruelty. One by one, he invited the generals who had helped him win the throne to lavish banquets, where they were honored with toasts and praise, before being quietly murdered. Han Xin, perhaps his most talented military commander, was lured to the palace by Empress Lu and executed on trumped-up charges of treason. The message was clear. Loyalty to the emperor was rewarded with death once that loyalty was no longer needed. But it was Gaozu's wife, Empress Lu Ji, who would establish some of the most disturbing precedents in Chinese imperial history. When Gaozu died in 195 BCE, she faced the traditional problem of imperial widows. How to maintain power in a system designed to exclude women from direct rule. Her solution was both brilliant and horrifying. Empress Lu began by targeting her husband's favorite concubine Qi, who had borne him a son that many believed should inherit the throne instead of Lu's own child. What followed was a display of cruelty so shocking that it would be whispered about in palace corridors for generations. Lu had concubine Qi's hands and feet chopped off, her eyes gouged out, and her tongue cut from her mouth. Then, as the ultimate humiliation, she had the mutilated woman thrown into a latrine, calling her a human pig. This wasn't simply revenge. It was a calculated demonstration of what happened to those who threatened the empress's power. The imperial court learned to fear not just the emperor, but the women who surrounded him, understanding that palace politics could be more deadly than any battlefield. Under Empress Lu's influence, the Han court developed elaborate rituals of humiliation and torture that would become standard practice for dealing with enemies. Suspected traitors weren't simply executed, they were subjected to the 5 punishments: tattooing, cutting off the nose, cutting off the feet, castration, and finally death. These weren't just punishments. They were public spectacles designed to terrorize the population into submission. The empress also pioneered the use of what would become known as palace purges, systematic eliminations of entire family lines that might pose a threat to imperial power. When she suspected a noble family of disloyalty, she wouldn't just execute the alleged traitor, but would order the deaths of parents, children, siblings, and even distant relatives. Entire bloodlines were wiped from existence to ensure that no one would survive to seek revenge. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how these brutal practices became normalized within the imperial system. What had once been seen as extreme measures became routine administrative procedures. Future emperors would inherit not just a throne, but a carefully refined apparatus of terror that made resistance seem futile. The Han dynasty's approach to governing was built on what modern historians call institutionalized paranoia. Every emperor lived in constant fear of assassination, rebellion, or palace coups, and this fear shaped every aspect of imperial life. The palace became a maze of hidden passages, secret chambers, and elaborate security measures designed to protect the emperor from both external enemies and internal threats. Emperor Wu, who ruled from 156 to 87 BCE, took this paranoia to new heights. Known as the martial emperor, he spent his reign in a constant state of military expansion, but his domestic policies were marked by a level of surveillance and control that would make modern dictatorships proud. He established networks of informants throughout the empire, encouraging subjects to spy on their neighbors, their family members, and even their own children. Under Wu's rule, the concept of thought crime became a reality. Citizens could be executed not just for rebellious actions, but for rebellious thoughts, suspicious associations, or even unlucky coincidences. If a natural disaster struck a region, local officials might be executed for failing to maintain proper harmony between heaven and earth. If crops failed, farmers could be tortured for neglecting their duties to the emperor. The emperor's personal life was equally disturbing. His harem contained thousands of women, many of them little more than children when they were brought to the palace. These weren't wives in any meaningful sense. They were human possessions, collected like precious objects and discarded when they lost their appeal. Most would live their entire lives within the palace walls, never seeing their families again, existing solely for the emperor's pleasure. But Wu's most chilling innovation was the development of what he called preventive execution. If his astrologers warned him that a particular family line might produce a future threat to the dynasty, he would order the elimination of that entire bloodline, including infants who couldn't possibly pose any immediate danger. Children were murdered in their cribs because star charts suggested they might grow up to challenge imperial authority. The psychological toll of this system on the emperors themselves was devastating. Wu spent his later years in a state of near constant terror, convinced that everyone around him was plotting his death. He would change his sleeping quarters multiple times each night, eat only food prepared by a handful of trusted servants, and conduct important meetings in rooms that had been searched repeatedly for hidden assassins. This paranoia manifested in increasingly bizarre behavior. The emperor began seeing omens and portents in everything around him. A bird flying in an unusual pattern might be interpreted as a sign of impending rebellion, leading to mass executions. A servant accidentally dropping a dish could trigger days of interrogation and torture as officials tried to determine if it was really an accident or part of some elaborate assassination plot. Wu's obsession with immortality rivaled that of Qin Shi Huang, but his approach was even more disturbing. He didn't just seek magical elixirs. He began experimenting with human sacrifice, believing that the life force of others could be transferred to him. Young, healthy individuals were brought to the palace and killed in elaborate rituals designed to extend the emperor's lifespan. Their blood was mixed into his food, their organs were prepared as medicine, and their deaths were celebrated as contributions to imperial longevity. The emperor's court, became a place where human life had no value beyond its utility to the ruler. Servants who displeased him weren't just dismissed, they were fed to wild animals in the imperial menagerie. Concubines who failed to bear sons were subjected to medical experiments conducted by court physicians, trying to determine why they had failed in their primary duty. Perhaps most horrifying was Wu's treatment of his own family. When his eldest son, Crown Prince Liu Ju, was implicated in a supposed plot against the throne, the emperor didn't just execute him. He ordered the prince to commit suicide, then had the prince's mother, wife, and children killed as well. The entire bloodline was eliminated to prevent any future challenges to imperial authority. But the prince's death wasn't the end of the family's suffering. Wu ordered that the prince's body be denied proper burial rites, left to rot as a warning to others who might consider rebellion. When court officials suggested that perhaps this treatment was too harsh for a member of the imperial family, Wu had them executed for questioning his judgment. The emperor's final years were marked by a descent into madness that horrified even his most loyal supporters. He began to believe that he was literally divine, that his body contained the essence of heaven itself. He ordered the construction of massive altars where he would perform rituals designed to communicate directly with the gods, often involving the sacrifice of hundreds of animals and dozens of human beings. Wu's death in 87 BCE came as a relief to an empire exhausted by decades of terror and paranoia. But the system he had refined and perfected lived on, passed down to successive emperors who would each add their own innovations to the machinery of imperial oppression. The Han dynasty continued for another century and a half, each emperor inheriting not just power, but the expectation that they would maintain the brutal traditions established by their predecessors. The throne of China had become not just a seat of authority, but a curse that corrupted everyone who occupied it, turning them into monsters who saw their subjects not as people, but as instruments to be used in the endless quest to maintain power. As we delve deeper into this dark history, we'll discover how these early patterns of imperial brutality evolved and intensified, creating a system of government so sophisticated in its cruelty that it would influence Chinese politics for over 2,000 years. The emperors who followed would build upon the foundations laid by Qin Shi Huang and refined by the Han, creating new forms of torture, new methods of control, and new ways to transform absolute power into absolute corruption. The stage was set for even greater horrors, as subsequent dynasties would compete not just for territory and wealth, but for the title of history's most creatively cruel rulers. The dragon throne awaited its next occupant, and with each succession, the darkness would only deepen. The collapse of the Han dynasty in 220 CE didn't bring peace to China. Instead, it unleashed 3 centuries of fragmentation and warfare that would make the previous imperial excesses seem almost quaint by comparison. From the ashes of Han, unity rose warlords who carved the empire into competing kingdoms, each ruled by men who believed that survival required outdoing their predecessors in both military prowess and creative brutality. This period, known as the Three Kingdoms era, produced some of the most psychologically disturbed rulers in Chinese history. Take Dong Zhuo, a general who seized control of the imperial capital and the last Han emperor. This wasn't a man content with mere political power. Dong Zhuo transformed the palace into his personal torture chamber, where he would spend hours devising new ways to torment his enemies. His favorite method of execution involved something he called the human candle. Prisoners would be wrapped in cloth soaked in oil, then set ablaze while still alive. Dong Zhuo would host dinner parties where these human torches provided the lighting, their screams serving as background music for his feasts. Guests who showed any sign of discomfort were marked for the same fate, ensuring that his banquets were filled with the forced laughter of terrified courtiers. But Dong Zhuo's cruelty extended beyond mere execution. He developed an obsession with psychological torture that revealed a mind completely divorced from human empathy. He would force parents to watch their children being slowly dismembered, not because the children had committed any crime, but simply to observe how much mental anguish a human being could endure before breaking completely. The general's treatment of women was particularly horrific. His harem wasn't just a collection of concubines. It was a laboratory for his sadistic experiments. He would pit women against each other in fights to the death, promising the winner freedom, while knowing full well that no one ever left his palace alive. The survivor of these contests would then be subjected to even worse torments, as Dong Zhuo believed that hope was the cruelest emotion to manipulate. When opposition to his rule finally coalesced into armed rebellion, Dong Zhuo's response was to burn the capital city to the ground rather than allow his enemies to claim it. But this wasn't just military strategy. It was the final expression of a man who had become so consumed by power that he preferred destruction to defeat. As flames consumed centuries of accumulated culture and history, Dong Zhuo reportedly stood on his palace balcony, laughing as the screams of burning civilians drifted up through the smoke. His death, when it finally came through assassination by his own adopted son, was celebrated throughout the empire, but the celebrations were premature. Dong Zhuo had shown future warlords just how far human cruelty could be pushed, and many were eager to test those boundaries themselves. In the southern kingdom of Wu, Sun Quan established what he called the Palace of Screams, a specialized facility designed exclusively for the torture of political prisoners. Unlike previous emperors who had used torture as a means to an end, Sun Quan elevated it to an art form. He employed teams of specialists who studied human anatomy not to heal, but to discover exactly how much pain the human body could endure without losing consciousness. These torture sessions weren't conducted in secret dungeons. Sun Quan had them performed in amphitheaters where court officials were required to attend and take notes. The emperor believed that watching the systematic destruction of human beings was essential education for anyone who served in his government. Those who showed weakness or sympathy during these displays were marked for future sessions as subjects rather than observers. The emperor's interest in torture wasn't purely sadistic, though the sadism was certainly present. He viewed it as a form of scientific research, a way to understand the limits of human endurance and willpower. His court physicians were required to keep detailed records of each session, noting which techniques produced the most pain, which methods lasted the longest before death, and which approaches were most effective at breaking a prisoner's spirit. Sun Quan's experiments led to innovations in cruelty that would influence Chinese imperial practices. For centuries, he developed the technique of gradual flaying, where a prisoner's skin would be removed in small strips over the course of weeks, with medical attention provided to ensure the victim remained conscious throughout the entire process. The removed skin would be preserved and displayed in the palace as trophies, with plaques indicating the crimes that had warranted such treatment. But perhaps most disturbing was Sun Quan's use of family members as leverage. He discovered that physical torture, however extreme, had limits. Eventually, even the strongest person would either break or die. Psychological torture, however, could continue indefinitely. He would capture entire family lines and torture them in front of each other, forcing parents to choose which of their children would suffer next, or making siblings compete in degrading contests to spare their relatives from worse fates. The emperor's court became a place where moral boundaries simply ceased to exist. Officials learned to suppress every human instinct toward compassion, knowing that any display of mercy would be interpreted as weakness and punished accordingly. The palace corridors echoed with the sound of weeping that no one dared acknowledge, as servants and nobles alike tried to pretend they couldn't hear the constant screams emanating from the torture chambers. Meanwhile, in the northern kingdom of Wei, Cao Cao was developing his own approach to imperial terror. Unlike Sun Quan's focus on individual torture, Cao Cao specialized in mass psychological warfare. He understood that fear was most effective when it was unpredictable, when people never knew who might be next, or what might trigger the emperor's wrath. Cao Cao would select entire villages at random and subject them to collective punishment for crimes they had never committed. The inhabitants would be forced to watch as their homes were burned, their livestock slaughtered, and their leaders executed, all while being told that this was happening because someone, somewhere in the empire, had displeased the emperor. The surviving villagers would then be relocated to other communities, where they would serve as living reminders of what could happen to anyone at any time. This system of arbitrary punishment created a population that lived in constant terror. No one felt safe, no matter how loyal they had been or how carefully they had followed imperial edicts. The mere fact that disaster could strike anyone without warning kept the entire kingdom in a state of paralyzed submission. But Cao Cao's most insidious innovation was his use of children as instruments of terror. He would identify families with particularly bright or talented children, then have those children brought to the palace ostensibly for education and advancement. The parents, naturally proud of their offspring's potential, would eagerly send their children to serve the emperor. Once at the palace, these children would be subjected to a carefully designed program of psychological conditioning that turned them into perfect instruments of surveillance and betrayal. They were taught to report on their own families, to identify signs of disloyalty in their home communities, and to view their parents and siblings not as loved ones, but as potential threats to imperial security. These child informants would then be sent back to their communities, where they would monitor their own families and neighbors for signs of rebellion or dissent. Parents found themselves afraid to speak freely in front of their own children, never knowing when an innocent comment might be reported to imperial authorities. The bonds of family trust, which had been the foundation of Chinese society for millennia, were systematically destroyed by Cao Cao's paranoid genius. The psychological impact of this system was devastating. Families became isolated units of mutual suspicion, communities fragmented into collections of fearful individuals, and the entire social fabric of the kingdom began to unravel. But from Cao Cao's perspective, this was exactly the desired outcome. A population that couldn't trust each other could never organize effective resistance against imperial authority. As the Three Kingdoms period dragged on, each ruler tried to outdo the others in both military might and creative cruelty. The competition wasn't just for territory anymore, it was for the title of most feared emperor. This arms race of terror produced innovations in oppression that would have been unimaginable to earlier dynasties. Liu Bei, the ruler of Shu, and ostensibly the most benevolent of the three emperors, developed what he called compassionate execution. Prisoners weren't simply killed, they were subjected to elaborate rituals designed to demonstrate the emperor's mercy. They would be given final meals, allowed to write letters to their families, and provided with religious comfort before being killed in ways that were supposedly painless. But this apparent kindness was actually a form of psychological torture more sophisticated than anything his rivals had devised. The condemned prisoners were given hope, allowed to believe that perhaps the emperor's mercy might extend to commutation of their sentences, only to have that hope systematically destroyed in the final moments of their lives. The emotional devastation of these false mercies often broke prisoners more completely than any physical torture could have achieved. Liu Bei's court developed elaborate protocols for these executions, with different ceremonies for different types of crimes. Political prisoners received one type of merciful death, common criminals another, and military captives a third. The emperor himself would often preside over these ceremonies, presenting himself as a benevolent ruler who took no pleasure in the necessity of execution, while privately savoring the psychological torment he was inflicting. The Three Kingdoms period came to an end in 280 CE, when the Jin dynasty reunified China under Emperor Wu. But the reunification didn't bring peace or an end to imperial cruelty. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new phase in the evolution of Chinese despotism, as the Jin emperors inherited and refined all the techniques of oppression developed during the centuries of division. Emperor Wu of Jin was particularly fascinated by the psychological aspects of torture that had been pioneered during the Three Kingdoms era. He established what he called the Institute of Human Studies, ostensibly a scholarly institution dedicated to understanding human nature, but actually a sophisticated torture laboratory where prisoners were subjected to systematic psychological abuse. The Institute's researchers would spend months breaking down a prisoner's personality, identifying their deepest fears, their strongest attachments, and their most cherished beliefs. Then they would systematically destroy each of these psychological foundations, not through physical pain, but through carefully orchestrated mental torture. A prisoner who loved their family might be shown false evidence that their relatives had denounced them as traitors. Someone who took pride in their integrity might be forced to commit increasingly degrading acts to avoid worse punishments. Religious individuals would be compelled to blaspheme against their own beliefs or watch as sacred objects were desecrated. The goal wasn't just to extract confessions or information. The Institute's true purpose was to discover how completely a human personality could be destroyed and rebuilt according to imperial specifications. Successful subjects would emerge from the process as completely loyal servants of the emperor, their original identities erased and replaced with manufactured personalities designed to serve imperial interests. But the Institute's most disturbing experiments involved what its researchers called inherited loyalty. They would take children from families suspected of disloyalty and subject them to years of carefully controlled psychological conditioning. These children would be raised to believe that their highest purpose was service to the emperor, that their own families were enemies of the state, and that betraying their blood relatives was the ultimate expression of virtue. These manufactured loyalists would then be sent back to their communities as adults, where they would systematically destroy their own families from within. They would fabricate evidence of treason, report on private conversations, and ultimately serve as witnesses at the trials that would lead to their parents' executions. The psychological programming was so thorough that these individuals genuinely believed they were performing acts of righteousness. The Jin dynasty's reign was relatively short, lasting only until 420 CE, but the techniques they developed would influence Chinese imperial practices for centuries to come. They had perfected the art of destroying not just bodies, but souls, creating methods of oppression so sophisticated that resistance became not just dangerous, but psychologically impossible. As China entered the period known as the Southern and Northern dynasties, the stage was set for even greater innovations in imperial cruelty. The emperors who would follow had inherited a toolkit of oppression refined over centuries of experimentation, and they were eager to add their own contributions to this dark legacy. The Dragon Throne continued to corrupt everyone who sat upon it, but now that corruption had become systematic, institutionalized, and passed down through generations like a hereditary disease, the sons of heaven had learned not just how to rule through fear, but how to make that fear so complete and pervasive that their subjects would eventually forget that any other way of life was possible. And in the shadows of their golden palaces, surrounded by gardens of impossible beauty, these divine rulers continued their endless experiments in human misery, secure in the knowledge that their power was absolute and their cruelty was sanctified by heaven itself. The worst, however, was yet to come. The period following the Jin collapse brought forth what historians would later call the Age of 16 Kingdoms, though that number barely captures the chaos that engulfed China from 304 to 439 CE. In this fractured landscape, dozens of warlords declared themselves emperors, each competing not just for territory, but for the distinction of being history's most memorably cruel ruler. Among these petty tyrants, few match the psychological complexity of Xile, founder of the later Zhao dynasty. Born into slavery, Xile's rise to power had given him an intimate understanding of human suffering that he would later weaponize with chilling effectiveness. Unlike emperors born into privilege, he knew exactly what it felt like to be powerless, and he used that knowledge to craft torments specifically designed to break the human spirit. Xile's palace became a theater of degradation, where former nobles were forced to perform the same menial tasks he had once endured as a slave. But this wasn't simple revenge. The emperor understood that humiliation could be more devastating than physical pain, and he orchestrated elaborate ceremonies where aristocrats would be stripped of their dignity, piece by piece. He would invite former enemies to lavish banquets, seating them at tables laden with delicacies they were forbidden to touch. Instead, they were forced to eat scraps from the floor, while Xile's genuine guests dined above them. The psychological torture wasn't just in the humiliation, but in the hope dangled before them that perhaps, if they degraded themselves sufficiently, they might earn a place at the actual table. But Xile's most insidious creation was what he called the Palace of Mirrors. This wasn't a single room, but an entire wing of his residence where every surface was polished to a reflective shine. Prisoners brought here were forced to confront their own image constantly, watching themselves deteriorate as they were subjected to various forms of abuse. The emperor believed that self-awareness magnified suffering exponentially. A person being tortured in darkness might maintain some psychological distance from their ordeal, but someone forced to watch their own degradation in crystal-clear detail would break much more quickly and completely. The mirrors weren't just reflective surfaces, they were instruments of psychological warfare. In these mirrored chambers, Xile would conduct what he termed educational sessions with captured enemies. These weren't interrogations in any traditional sense. The emperor had no interest in extracting information or confessions. Instead, he wanted to demonstrate his complete power over human consciousness itself. Prisoners would be positioned so they could see themselves from multiple angles as they were subjected to various indignities. They would watch their own faces contort with pain, observe their own bodies betray them, witness their own dignity being systematically stripped away. The psychological impact was devastating, as victims became unwilling participants in their own destruction. Shilo's fascination with mirrors extended beyond torture chambers. His entire court was designed around the concept of reflection and observation. Courtiers learned to watch not just the emperor, but themselves, constantly monitoring their own expressions and reactions to ensure they displayed appropriate responses to imperial whims. The emperor would often conduct important meetings in circular rooms lined with mirrors, claiming that this allowed him to observe everyone's true reactions to his pronouncements. In reality, it created an atmosphere of paranoid self-consciousness, where officials became so focused on managing their own reflections that they lost the ability to think critically about imperial policies. This psychological manipulation extended to Shilei's treatment of his own family. His children were raised in environments where their every action was reflected back to them through strategically placed mirrors. They grew up believing that they were constantly being watched and judged, not just by their father, but by themselves. The emperor's eldest son, Shi Hong, developed what court physicians termed mirror madness, an obsessive compulsion to check his reflection that eventually left him unable to function in environments without reflective surfaces. When Shi Hong was forced to travel to provinces where mirrors were scarce, he would suffer panic attacks so severe that he would order his servants to carry polished metal shields just so he could continue monitoring his appearance. But Shilo's innovations in psychological torture were merely a prelude to the horrors that would emerge under his successor, Shi Hu, who took the throne in 334 CE. If Shilei had been an artist of mental torment, Shi Hu was its mad scientist, approaching cruelty with a systematic methodology that treated human suffering as a subject for empirical study. Shi Hu established what he called the Academy of Human Nature, ostensibly an institution of higher learning, but actually a sophisticated laboratory for studying pain, fear, and psychological breakdown. The Academy's scholars were tasked with documenting human responses to various forms of torture, creating detailed catalogs of which techniques were most effective against different personality types. The emperor's approach was ruthlessly scientific. Prisoners were categorized by age, gender, social background, and psychological profile, then subjected to carefully controlled experiments designed to test their responses to different forms of abuse. The Academy's researchers maintained meticulous records, noting how long it took different types of individuals to break under specific circumstances. These studies weren't conducted out of mere curiosity. Shi Hu was building a comprehensive understanding of human psychology that he intended to use for more effective governance. He believed that if he could predict exactly how different types of people would respond to various forms of pressure, he could design a system of control so precise that rebellion would become literally unthinkable. The Academy's most disturbing research focused on what its scholars termed inherited fear. Researchers would study how trauma experienced by parents affected their children, documenting the ways that psychological damage could be passed down through generations. They discovered that children of torture victims often displayed symptoms of trauma, even if they had never been directly abused themselves. This discovery led Shi Hu to develop a long-term strategy for population control. Rather than simply terrorizing his current subjects, he would traumatize them in ways that would psychologically damage their children and grandchildren. The fear he instilled wouldn't just control the present generation. It would echo through bloodlines for decades to come. The emperor's researchers documented how children of torture victims were more likely to be submissive, how they avoided behavior that might draw attention, and how they instinctively feared authority figures. These findings led to the development of what Shi Hu called generational pacification, a system designed to create populations that were psychologically incapable of resistance. Under this system, suspected dissidents weren't just punished themselves. Their children would be subjected to carefully calibrated trauma designed to ensure lifelong compliance with imperial authority. These children would grow up to raise their own offspring in an atmosphere of inherited fear, creating communities where rebellion wasn't just dangerous, it was psychologically impossible. The Academy's research extended beyond individual psychology to study group dynamics and social control. Researchers would create artificial communities within the palace grounds, populated by prisoners and their families, then subject these communities to various forms of collective punishment to observe how social bonds could be systematically destroyed. They discovered that communities could be most effectively controlled by turning their members against each other, by creating systems where survival depended on betraying one's neighbors. The Academy's researchers could transform tight-knit communities into collections of isolated, mutually suspicious individuals who pose no collective threat to imperial authority. These findings led to the implementation of neighborhood surveillance systems throughout Shihu's territory. Communities were divided into small groups, with each member responsible for monitoring and reporting on the others. Anyone who failed to report suspicious behavior would be held equally responsible for their neighbor's crimes. But the emperor's most chilling innovation was his use of children as instruments of family destruction. The Academy's research had shown that children could be conditioned to betray their parents more easily than adults could be forced to betray their children. This led to the establishment of imperial schools, where young children were systematically programmed to view their families as potential enemies of the state. These schools didn't just teach loyalty to the emperor, they actively undermined family bonds. Children were encouraged to report on private family conversations, to question their parents' loyalty, and to view themselves as representatives of imperial authority within their own homes. Parents found themselves afraid to speak freely in front of their own children, never knowing when an innocent comment might be reported to school authorities. The psychological impact on families was devastating. The most intimate relationships became sources of potential danger as parents struggled to maintain emotional connections with children who had been programmed to view them with suspicion. Many families simply stopped communicating altogether, existing as collections of isolated individuals who happened to share living space. Shihu's reign lasted until 349 CE, but his innovations in psychological control would influence Chinese imperial practices for centuries. He had demonstrated that effective tyranny wasn't just about inspiring fear, it was about reshaping human psychology itself. Future emperors would study his methods and build upon his insights, creating ever more sophisticated systems of mental and emotional control. The later Zhao dynasty collapsed shortly after Shihu's death, but the techniques he had pioneered lived on. Subsequent rulers would inherit not just territories and armies, but detailed manuals on human psychology and social control that had been purchased with the suffering of countless victims. As China moved toward eventual reunification under the Sui dynasty, the accumulated knowledge of centuries of imperial cruelty would be refined and systematized into what would become the most sophisticated apparatus of despotic control the world had ever seen. The Dragon Throne had evolved from a seat of arbitrary power into something far more sinister, a position that came with detailed instruction manuals on how to destroy human souls. The emperors who would follow would stand on the shoulders of giants, but these were giants of cruelty, whose legacy was measured not in monuments or cultural achievements, but in the perfection of human misery as a tool of governance. and in the shadows of their golden palaces, surrounded by gardens where beauty bloomed over graves, they would continue their endless refinement of suffering, secure in their divine mandate to rule over subjects who had been psychologically engineered to accept any horror as the natural order of heaven and earth. The worst innovations in imperial cruelty, however, were still to come, as future dynasties would take these established techniques and push them to extremes that would have shocked even the most creative tyrants of the past. The reunification of China under the Sui dynasty in 581 CE promised a new beginning, an end to centuries of fragmentation and warfare. Emperor Wen, the dynasty's founder, presented himself as a benevolent ruler who would heal the wounds left by generations of petty tyrants. But beneath his carefully crafted image of imperial virtue lurked appetites that would make his predecessor's cruelties seem almost restrained by comparison. Yang Jian, who became Emperor Wen, understood that effective tyranny required a more sophisticated approach than the crude brutalities of earlier dynasties. He didn't abandon the techniques of psychological control developed by rulers like Shihu, but rather refined them into something more elegant and far more insidious. Where previous emperors had ruled through obvious terror, Wen perfected the art of hidden horror. His palace became a theater of carefully orchestrated deception, where acts of monstrous cruelty were disguised as expressions of imperial benevolence. Prisoners weren't simply tortured, they were corrected through educational experiences designed to help them understand their errors. Families weren't destroyed, they were restructured to better serve the needs of the state. Entire communities weren't eliminated. They were relocated to areas where they could contribute more effectively to imperial prosperity. This linguistic manipulation wasn't mere propaganda. Wen understood that controlling language was the key to controlling thought itself. By redefining cruelty as kindness, oppression as protection, and slavery as service, he created a reality where his subjects genuinely believed that their suffering was a gift from their benevolent emperor. The Sui court developed elaborate ceremonies that celebrated acts of imperial mercy. When Wen ordered the execution of thousands of suspected dissidents, the event was presented as a compassionate cleansing that freed these individuals from the burden of their treasonous thoughts. When families were torn apart and their members scattered across the empire, courtiers praised the emperor's wisdom in providing these people with opportunities to serve in new locations. But Wen's most disturbing innovation was his approach to what he called preventive harmony. Unlike previous emperors who waited for rebellion to manifest before crushing it, Wen sought to eliminate the very possibility of dissent by reshaping human nature itself. He established networks of scholars and physicians whose task was to identify the psychological and physical characteristics that predisposed individuals toward rebellious behavior. These imperial researchers conducted extensive studies on everything from facial features to dietary preferences, seeking patterns that might indicate potential disloyalty. They developed detailed profiles of the rebellious personality, documenting traits like independence of thought, questioning of authority, and emotional attachment to family members as warning signs of future treachery. Once these characteristics were identified, Wen implemented systematic programs designed to eliminate them from the population. Children who displayed too much curiosity were subjected to educational corrections that suppressed their natural inquisitiveness. Adults who showed excessive attachment to their families were helped to understand that their highest loyalty should be to the emperor. Communities that maintained traditional customs were guided toward more appropriate expressions of cultural identity. The emperor's physicians developed techniques for what they termed personality adjustment, using combinations of drugs, psychological manipulation, and controlled trauma to modify individual behavior patterns. These weren't crude attempts at mind control, but sophisticated interventions based on detailed understanding of human psychology and physiology. Subjects selected for personality adjustment would be brought to special facilities disguised as medical clinics or educational institutions. There, teams of specialists would work for months or even years to systematically reprogram their thoughts, emotions, and behavioral responses. The process was gradual and seemingly gentle, designed to make subjects believe they were undergoing beneficial treatment rather than psychological destruction. The most successful cases would emerge from these facilities as model citizens, displaying perfect loyalty to imperial authority and complete contentment with their assigned roles in society. They would return to their communities as living examples of the emperor's benevolence, praising the wonderful treatment they had received and encouraging others to volunteer for similar improvements. But Emperor Wen's reign was merely a prelude to the horrors that would unfold under his son, Yang Guang, who became Emperor Yang in 604 CE. Where his father had been a master of subtle manipulation, Yang was an artist of spectacular excess, whose appetites knew no bounds, and whose imagination for cruelty was matched only by his resources to implement it. Yang's ascension to the throne marked the beginning of what court historians would later euphemistically call the period of grand projects, though a more accurate description might be the age of magnificent madness. The new emperor didn't just want to rule China. He wanted to remake it entirely according to his own grandiose vision, regardless of the human cost. His first and most infamous project was the construction of the Grand Canal, a waterway system designed to connect the northern and southern regions of the empire. On paper, it was a brilliant piece of infrastructure that would facilitate trade and communication across vast distances. In reality, it became a monument to human suffering on a scale that dwarfed even the Great Wall's deadly construction. Yang conscripted over 1 million workers for the canal project, but these weren't volunteers seeking employment. They were peasants torn from their families, prisoners of war, and anyone else who happened to be in the wrong place when imperial recruiters came calling. The working conditions were so brutal that contemporary sources suggest nearly half of the workforce died during construction. But the deaths weren't simply the result of harsh labor or dangerous working conditions. Yang had developed a philosophy that viewed human life as the ultimate artistic medium, and he approached the canal construction as an opportunity to create what he called living sculptures from the bodies of his workers. Sections of the canal were designed around elaborate arrangements of human remains, with workers who died during construction being incorporated directly into the waterway's structure. Their bones were used as foundation material. Their preserved bodies were positioned as decorative elements along the canal banks, and their skulls were arranged in intricate patterns that supposedly represented the flow of imperial power throughout the realm. The emperor personally oversaw many of these macabre installations, treating them as artistic collaborations between himself and death. He would spend hours arranging corpses in aesthetically pleasing configurations, discussing with his architects how human remains could be most effectively integrated into the canal's overall design scheme. Yang's obsession with death as an art form extended far beyond construction projects. His palace became a gallery where human suffering was displayed as entertainment for the imperial court. He established what he called the Garden of Final Moments, an elaborate complex where condemned prisoners were executed in carefully choreographed performances designed to showcase different aspects of human mortality. These weren't simple executions, but theatrical productions that could last for days or even weeks. Prisoners would be costumed and given roles to play in elaborate dramas that ended with their deaths. The emperor and his guests would critique each performance, offering suggestions for how future executions might be staged more effectively. The garden featured different themed areas, each designed around specific methods of killing. The pavilion of gradual departure specialized in slow deaths that allowed spectators to observe the complete process of human dissolution. The theater of final expressions focused on capturing the exact moment when life left the body. The gallery of transformed flesh displayed the artistic possibilities of human remains after death. Yang's court artists were required to attend these performances and create works inspired by what they witnessed. Paintings, sculptures, and musical compositions were all expected to reflect the aesthetic lessons learned from observing human death. The emperor believed that art that didn't incorporate an understanding of mortality was fundamentally incomplete and unworthy of imperial patronage. But perhaps most disturbing of all was Yang's treatment of his own family members. He viewed his relatives not as loved ones, but as artistic subjects whose lives and deaths could be shaped according to his creative vision. When his brother dared to criticize one of the emperor's projects, Yang didn't simply have him executed. Instead, he designed an elaborate year-long death that was intended to serve as the centerpiece of the palace's artistic season. The brother was kept alive through careful medical intervention while being subjected to a series of increasingly severe mutilations, each designed to create specific visual and emotional effects. Court artists documented every stage of the process, creating a comprehensive record of human degradation that Yang considered one of his greatest artistic achievements. The emperor's wife and children lived in constant terror, never knowing when they might be selected for inclusion in one of his artistic projects. Palace life became a nightmare of forced smiles and careful words, as family members struggled to avoid saying or doing anything that might inspire the emperor's creative attention. Yang's artistic vision extended beyond individual deaths to encompass entire communities. He would select villages or neighborhoods that displeased him and transform them into what he called living installations. The inhabitants wouldn't be killed immediately, but would be subjected to systematic modifications designed to create specific aesthetic effects. Buildings would be altered to create particular visual compositions, with residents forced to arrange themselves within these structures according to the emperor's artistic vision. People would be assigned specific poses or activities that they were required to maintain for hours or days at a time, creating human sculptures that could be viewed and appreciated by imperial visitors. These community art projects could continue for months, with residents gradually weakening and dying from the strain of maintaining their assigned positions. The emperor viewed this slow transformation from living community to artistic installation as the ultimate expression of his creative power over both human life and the physical environment. Yang's reign reached its artistic climax with the construction of his new capital at Luoyang, a city designed entirely around the aesthetic principles he had developed through years of experimenting with human suffering. Every building, every street, every public space was positioned to create specific visual and emotional effects that would reinforce the emperor's absolute authority over both life and death. The city's central palace complex was built around a series of courtyards where different forms of human suffering were displayed as permanent installations. Visitors approaching the imperial throne would pass through galleries of preserved human remains, chambers where living prisoners were displayed in artistic arrangements, and gardens where condemned individuals served as decorative elements in elaborate landscape designs. But Yang's grand artistic vision ultimately proved to be his downfall. The massive resources required for his projects drained the imperial treasury and exhausted the patience of his subjects. Rebellions began erupting throughout the empire as communities that had survived centuries of imperial oppression finally reached their breaking point under the weight of Yang's aesthetic demands. The emperor's response to these rebellions was to treat them as opportunities for even grander artistic projects. He began designing elaborate punishments for entire provinces, planning massive installations that would incorporate thousands of rebels into comprehensive artistic statements about the futility of opposing imperial authority. But before these final projects could be completed, Yang's own generals turned against him. In 618 CE, he was assassinated by members of his own court, who had grown tired of living in fear of becoming subjects in his next artistic endeavor. The Sui dynasty collapsed almost immediately, its brief reign remembered not for any lasting achievements, but for pushing the boundaries of imperial cruelty into realms that previous tyrants had never imagined. Yang's death marked the end of an era in Chinese imperial history, but it also established new benchmarks for creative brutality that would influence future dynasties. The techniques he had developed for transforming human suffering into art would be studied and refined by subsequent emperors, each seeking to surpass their predecessors in both the scope and sophistication of their cruelty. As China entered the Tang dynasty period, the stage was set for imperial excesses that would make even Yang's artistic experiments seem restrained by comparison. The Dragon Throne continued to corrupt everyone who occupied it, but now that corruption was informed by centuries of accumulated knowledge about human psychology, social control, and the aesthetic possibilities of systematic oppression, the emperors who would follow had inherited not just power, but detailed manuals on how to transform entire civilizations into instruments of their will. And in the golden halls of their magnificent palaces, surrounded by gardens where beauty bloomed over mass graves, they would continue pushing the boundaries of human cruelty until even heaven itself seemed to weep at what had become of the sons of heaven. The darkness was far from over. In fact, the most sophisticated and disturbing innovations in imperial brutality were still to come, as future dynasties would take the foundations laid by their predecessors and build upon them structures of oppression so complete and so subtle that their subjects would eventually forget that freedom had ever been possible. The rise of the Tang dynasty in 618 CE should have marked a new dawn for China, a return to order after the chaos of Yang's artistic madness. Emperor Gaozu, the dynasty's founder, promised his exhausted subjects that the days of imperial excess were over. He spoke of benevolent governance, of ruling through virtue rather than terror. But the throne of China had become something more than a seat of power. It was a corruption machine that twisted even the most well-intentioned souls into monsters. Li Yuan, who became Emperor Gaozu, began his reign with genuine attempts at reform. He reduced taxes, released political prisoners, and dismantled some of the more obviously horrific apparatus of Sui oppression. For a brief moment, it seemed as though China might finally have an emperor who remembered that his subjects were human beings rather than artistic materials. But power has its own logic, and the machinery of imperial control that had been refined over centuries didn't simply disappear because one man wished it so. The bureaucrats who had served Yang remained in their positions, bringing with them detailed knowledge of how to manipulate, control, and terrorize populations. The palace guards who had protected Sui tyranny now protected Tang authority. The physicians who had developed techniques for personality adjustment continued their research under new imperial patronage. More insidious still was the way the throne itself seemed to whisper to its occupants. Gaozu found himself making small compromises with the brutal traditions he had inherited. A political enemy couldn't simply be exiled. The precedent demanded execution. A rebellious province couldn't be reasoned with. Centuries of imperial practice suggested that collective punishment was more effective. Each compromise seemed reasonable in isolation, but together they began rebuilding the very system Gaozu had promised to dismantle. The emperor's transformation became apparent in his treatment of the Turkic peoples along China's northern borders. Initially, he had sought diplomatic solutions to border conflicts, offering trade agreements and cultural exchanges. But when these peaceful overtures were rejected, Gaozu's response revealed how thoroughly the throne had already begun to corrupt him. Rather than launching conventional military campaigns, the emperor authorized what his generals called demographic restructuring of Turkic territories. This wasn't conquest in any traditional sense, but something far more sinister. Chinese forces would capture Turkic communities and systematically destroy their cultural identity through techniques that had been perfected during centuries of internal oppression. Turkic children were separated from their families and raised in Chinese institutions where they were taught to despise their own heritage. Adults were subjected to intensive re-education programs designed to erase their memories of tribal customs and replace them with loyalty to Chinese imperial authority. Entire communities were relocated to distant provinces, where they would be surrounded by Chinese settlers and gradually absorbed into the imperial population. But Gaozu's most disturbing innovation was his use of what court scholars termed cultural alchemy. Just as previous emperors had experimented with transforming base metals into gold, Gaozu became obsessed with transforming foreign peoples into Chinese subjects. He established research facilities where captured Turkic leaders were studied like laboratory specimens, with imperial scholars documenting every aspect of their psychology, culture, and social organization. These studies weren't conducted out of anthropological curiosity. Gaozu wanted to understand exactly how Turkic identity was constructed so that he could systematically dismantle it. His researchers developed detailed maps of Turkic cultural psychology, identifying the beliefs, customs, and social bonds that held their communities together. Then they designed targeted interventions to destroy each of these elements. The process was gradual and seemingly benevolent. Turkic subjects weren't simply forced to abandon their customs. They were slowly convinced that Chinese ways were superior. Their traditional religious practices were replaced with Chinese spiritual traditions that appeared similar but gradually eroded their connection to Turkic identity. Their social structures were modified through seemingly minor administrative changes that eventually made traditional leadership impossible. Over the course of several years, entire Turkic populations would be transformed into Chinese subjects who genuinely believed they had always been Chinese. They would look back on their previous lives as barbarians with gratitude for the emperor's civilizing influence, never realizing that their memories had been systematically manipulated and their identities completely reconstructed. This cultural alchemy proved so effective that Gaozu began applying it to internal dissidents as well. Rather than simply executing political opponents, he would have them subjected to identity reconstruction that transformed them into enthusiastic supporters of imperial authority. Former rebels would emerge from these programs as some of the emperor's most loyal servants. Their previous opposition to imperial rule replaced with passionate advocacy for the very system they had once fought against. The emperor's courtiers watched this transformation with a mixture of admiration and terror. They understood that if Gaozu could so completely remake the minds of his enemies, no one was truly safe from imperial manipulation. Palace life became an exercise in carefully managed performance, as officials struggled to ensure that their thoughts, as well as their actions, remained acceptable to imperial authority. But Gaozu's reign was merely the foundation for what would come under his son, Li Shimin, who became Emperor Taizong in 626 CE. Where his father had been a reluctant innovator in imperial cruelty, Taizong embraced the dark possibilities of absolute power with an enthusiasm that shocked even veteran courtiers who had served under Yang. Taizong understood that effective tyranny required more than just the ability to punish enemies. It required the capacity to shape reality itself, to control not just what people did, but what they thought and remembered. He established what he called the Ministry of Historical Truth, ostensibly an institution dedicated to recording imperial achievements, but actually a sophisticated apparatus for manufacturing false memories and rewriting the past. The ministry's scholars didn't simply write favorable accounts of imperial actions. They developed techniques for implanting false memories in entire populations, convincing people that events they had personally witnessed had actually unfolded differently. Rebellions that had been brutally suppressed were remembered as peaceful negotiations. Massacres became celebrations. Oppression transformed into liberation. This wasn't mere propaganda, which people might resist or disbelieve. The ministry's techniques actually altered human memory at a neurological level, using combinations of drugs, hypnosis, and psychological manipulation to rewrite the contents of individual minds. Subjects who underwent these treatments would genuinely believe the false memories they had been given, defending them as passionately as if they were recounting personal experiences. The process began with the identification of key witnesses to events that reflected poorly on imperial authority. These individuals would be invited to the palace for what appeared to be honor ceremonies celebrating their service to the empire. During these events, they would be exposed to carefully designed sensory experiences that gradually overwrote their actual memories with imperial-approved versions. The techniques were subtle and sophisticated. Rather than simply telling subjects that their memories were wrong, the ministry's specialists would create immersive environments that made false memories feel more real than actual experiences. Subjects would be surrounded by actors playing roles in fabricated historical scenes, exposed to forged documents that supported false narratives, and given drugs that enhanced their susceptibility to suggestion. Over the course of several days or weeks, witnesses to imperial atrocities would gradually come to believe that they had actually observed acts of imperial benevolence. They would return to their communities as enthusiastic advocates for the very emperor who had brutalized them, spreading their false memories to friends and family members who trusted their accounts. But Taizong's most chilling innovation was his development of what he called inherited memory modification. The ministry's researchers discovered that traumatic memories could be passed from parents to children through mechanisms that weren't fully understood, but could be systematically exploited. By modifying the memories of adults, they could influence the psychological development of their offspring. Children whose parents had undergone memory modification would grow up with inherited impressions that supported imperial authority, even if they had never been directly exposed to imperial propaganda. These psychological imprints would be passed down through generations, creating family lines that were genetically predisposed to imperial loyalty. The emperor's long-term vision was to create a population that was psychologically incapable of remembering or imagining alternatives to imperial rule. Future generations would be born with inherited memories that supported the dynasty's legitimacy, making rebellion not just dangerous, but literally unthinkable. This project of psychological engineering extended beyond individual memory modification to encompass the complete reconstruction of Chinese historical consciousness. Taizong ordered the systematic destruction of all records that contradicted imperial narratives, replacing them with fabricated documents that supported his version of events. But these weren't simply false documents created to deceive future historians. The ministry's scholars used advanced techniques to create artifacts that would pass any historical scrutiny, complete with appropriate aging, correct materials, and authentic-seeming writing styles. They manufactured an entire alternative history of China, complete with forged archaeological evidence, fictional ancient texts, and elaborate genealogies that traced the Tang dynasty's legitimacy back to mythical golden ages. The scope of this historical reconstruction was breathtaking. Entire centuries of Chinese history were rewritten to eliminate any record of successful resistance to imperial authority. Previous dynasties were portrayed as having ruled through universal consent rather than force. The very concept of rebellion was gradually erased from historical memory, replaced with narratives of voluntary submission to benevolent imperial guidance. Taizong's reign established the template that would guide Chinese imperial behavior for the next 1,000 years. He had demonstrated that effective tyranny wasn't just about controlling present behavior, but about controlling memory, history, and the very categories through which people understood their relationship to authority. The emperor's successors would inherit not just a throne, but a comprehensive system for manufacturing consent that operated at levels so deep that subjects weren't even aware they were being manipulated. The dragon throne had evolved from a seat of arbitrary power into something far more sophisticated, a position that came with detailed instruction manuals for reshaping human consciousness itself. As Taizong's reign continued, his innovations in psychological control became increasingly elaborate. He established networks of memory custodians throughout the empire, specially trained officials whose job was to monitor popular recollections of historical events and make subtle corrections when necessary. These custodians didn't operate through obvious censorship or propaganda, but through carefully orchestrated social interactions that gradually shifted community memories in directions that supported imperial authority. The custodians would attend local festivals, market gatherings, and family celebrations, participating in conversations about the past while subtly introducing alternative versions of events. They were trained in sophisticated techniques of social psychology that allowed them to influence group memories without anyone realizing they were being manipulated. Over time, entire communities would find their collective memories gradually shifting toward imperial-approved narratives. Stories that had been passed down through generations would slowly transform, with details that reflected poorly on imperial rule being forgotten, while elements that supported dynastic legitimacy became more prominent in popular recollection. But perhaps most disturbing of all was Taizong's treatment of his own family members. The emperor understood that his relatives posed the greatest potential threat to his authority, not because they were necessarily disloyal, but because they possessed intimate knowledge of imperial weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Rather than eliminating potential family rivals through execution, which might create martyrs or inspire revenge, Taizong developed techniques for psychologically neutering them. His brothers, sons, and nephews were subjected to subtle forms of mental conditioning that left them physically intact, but psychologically incapable of independent thought or action. These family members would live luxurious lives within the palace complex, surrounded by every comfort and luxury imaginable. But their minds would be carefully managed through combinations of drugs, psychological manipulation, and social isolation that left them dependent on imperial approval for their sense of identity and self-worth. The emperor's relatives became living examples of imperial mercy, seemingly proof that Taizong treated even potential rivals with kindness and generosity. In reality, they were psychological prisoners whose gilded cages were more effective than any dungeon at preventing them from challenging imperial authority. As Taizong's reign progressed, these techniques of mental control became so sophisticated that the line between voluntary loyalty and psychological manipulation completely disappeared. The emperor's subjects genuinely believed they loved him, never realizing that their emotions had been systematically engineered through decades of careful conditioning. The Tang court became a place where reality itself was malleable, where the past could be rewritten, memories could be modified, and human consciousness could be reshaped according to imperial specifications. It was the culmination of centuries of experimentation in the possibilities of absolute power, a system so complete and so subtle that its victims celebrated their own oppression as liberation. And in the shadow of the dragon throne, surrounded by gardens where beauty bloomed over the graves of forgotten truths, Emperor Taizong continued his grand experiment in human consciousness, secure in the knowledge that he had finally solved the ancient problem of imperial succession. Future emperors would inherit not just power, but subjects who had been psychologically engineered to worship their oppressors and forget that freedom had ever existed. The worst was yet to come, however, as Taizong's innovations would be inherited and refined by successors who would push the boundaries of imperial control into realms that even he had never imagined possible. The death of Emperor Taizong in 649 CE should have brought relief to an empire exhausted by decades of psychological manipulation and social engineering. Instead, it marked the beginning of an even darker chapter in Chinese imperial history, as the throne passed not to his chosen heir, but to a woman whose hunger for power would make her predecessor's innovations in cruelty seem almost quaint by comparison. Wu Zetian didn't simply seize the dragon throne through the traditional methods of palace intrigue and military support. She rewrote the very rules of imperial succession, transforming herself from a lowly concubine into the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own right. But her path to power was paved with psychological torments so sophisticated that they would influence Chinese politics for centuries to come. Born into a merchant family around 624 CE, Wu Zetian entered the imperial court as a young concubine to Emperor Taizong. In any normal circumstances, she would have lived and died in obscurity, one of thousands of women who existed solely for imperial pleasure. But Wu possessed something that set her apart from her fellow concubines, an understanding of human psychology so acute that she could manipulate the deepest fears and desires of anyone around her. Her rise began not with seduction, but with the systematic psychological destruction of her rivals. Wu didn't simply compete with other concubines for imperial attention. She studied them like specimens, identifying their weaknesses, their fears, and their most cherished relationships. Then, she would orchestrate elaborate campaigns of mental torture designed to drive them to madness or suicide. Her methods were subtle and seemingly innocent. A rival concubine might receive anonymous gifts that reminded her of a dead child. Another might find that servants began treating her with barely concealed disgust for reasons she couldn't understand. A third might discover that her family members were being subjected to mysterious hardships that seemed unconnected to palace politics, but followed patterns that only she could recognize. Wu's genius lay in her ability to make her victims complicit in their own destruction. She would create situations where rival concubines were forced to make choices that isolated them from potential allies or compromised their moral principles. A woman desperate to protect her family might be maneuvered into betraying a friend. Someone trying to maintain her dignity might be placed in circumstances where survival required degrading herself. The psychological pressure would build gradually over months or years until Wu's targets would collapse under the weight of their own accumulated shame and terror. They would remove themselves from competition through suicide, mental breakdown, or voluntary exile to distant monasteries. To outside observers, it appeared that Wu's rivals were simply unable to handle the pressures of court life, while Wu herself seemed to glide through the same environment with serene confidence. When Emperor Taizong died, Wu should have been relegated to a Buddhist convent along with the rest of his concubines. Instead, she had already begun seducing his son and heir, the future Emperor Gaozong. But this wasn't a simple romantic relationship. Wu had identified in the young prince the same psychological vulnerabilities she had exploited in others, and she set about systematically making him dependent on her for emotional stability. Gaozong suffered from what court physicians described as attacks of the head, likely severe migraines or possibly epileptic seizures that left him temporarily incapacitated. Wu positioned herself as the only person who could provide relief during these episodes, using combinations of massage, herbal treatments, and psychological comfort that made the prince associate her presence with the cessation of pain. But Wu's treatments weren't purely beneficial. She had studied enough court medicine to understand how to trigger as well as relieve Gaozong's symptoms. She would subtly increase the stress in his environment through carefully orchestrated palace intrigues, then appear as his savior when the resulting tension triggered one of his attacks. Over time, the prince became psychologically addicted to her presence, unable to function normally without her constant attention and care. When Gaozong became emperor in 649 CE, Wu's transformation from concubine to power broker accelerated dramatically. She didn't content herself with behind-the-scenes influence. She began systematically eliminating anyone who might challenge her authority over the emperor. Her first targets were Gaozong's existing wife and favored concubine, both of whom she destroyed through techniques that demonstrated her growing sophistication in psychological warfare. The emperor's wife, Empress Wang, was a decent woman from a powerful family who posed a political threat to Wu's ambitions. Rather than attacking her directly, Wu orchestrated what appeared to be a series of unfortunate coincidences that gradually undermined the empress's position. Palace servants began reporting minor infractions of protocol that suggested the empress was losing her mind. Important documents would go missing from her chambers. Religious ceremonies she organized would be disrupted by seemingly accidental mishaps that made her appear incompetent or unlucky. But Wu's masterstroke was the death of her own infant daughter, an event that remains one of the most controversial episodes in Chinese imperial history. According to some accounts, Wu strangled the baby herself, then arranged for the empress to be found near the child's body. Whether or not Wu actually committed infanticide, she certainly exploited the tragedy to destroy her rival, using the emperor's grief and confusion to convince him that the empress had murdered the child out of jealousy. The psychological manipulation involved in this episode reveals the depths of Wu's understanding of human nature. She had studied Gaozong carefully enough to predict exactly how he would react to different scenarios, then orchestrated events to produce the emotional responses she desired. The emperor's genuine anguish became a weapon in Wu's hands. His grief transformed into rage against the woman Wu wanted eliminated. Empress Wang and the favored concubine were not simply executed. Wu had them subjected to a form of torture that demonstrated her growing creativity in the infliction of suffering. Their hands and feet were cut off, and they were thrown into wine vats, where they slowly drowned in alcohol, their final moments consumed by both physical agony and the psychological torment of knowing they had been destroyed by a woman they had underestimated. With her rivals eliminated, Wu began the process of transforming herself from imperial concubine to co-ruler. She didn't simply demand recognition of her authority. She gradually made herself indispensable to the functioning of the imperial government. As Gaozong's health problems worsened, possibly exacerbated by Wu's subtle manipulations, she positioned herself as the only person capable of managing state affairs during his incapacitation. Wu's approach to governance revealed the full extent of her psychological sophistication. Where previous emperors had ruled through obvious displays of power, she perfected the art of invisible control. Her subjects obeyed her not because they feared her, but because she had convinced them that obedience was their own idea. She established what she called councils of voluntary service, groups of officials who competed for the privilege of implementing her policies. These councils weren't appointed through traditional bureaucratic channels. Instead, Wu created elaborate selection processes that made officials feel they had earned their positions through merit and dedication. The psychological effect was profound. Rather than feeling coerced into serving a usurper, these officials genuinely believed they were participating in a noble enterprise. But Wu's most insidious innovation was her development of what court scholars termed distributed responsibility. Rather than issuing direct orders that might be traced back to her, she created systems where her desires were implemented through chains of seemingly independent decisions made by officials who believed they were acting on their own initiative. A region that displeased Wu wouldn't receive a direct imperial command to change its behavior. Instead, local officials would find themselves gradually convinced that reform was necessary through carefully orchestrated conversations with traveling inspectors, mysterious delays in supply shipments that could only be resolved through policy changes, and subtle social pressures from colleagues who had been similarly manipulated. The result was a form of governance so subtle that Wu's subjects often implemented her will without realizing they were being controlled. Entire provinces would reshape themselves according to her preferences, while their leaders genuinely believed they were responding to local conditions and their own insights into effective administration. Wu's techniques of invisible control extended to her treatment of potential rivals within the imperial family. Rather than eliminating Gaozong's sons through execution, which might create martyrs or inspire revenge, she subjected them to psychological conditioning that left them alive but utterly dependent on her approval. The princes were raised in environments where Wu controlled every aspect of their emotional and intellectual development. They were surrounded by carefully selected tutors, servants, and companions who had been conditioned to reinforce Wu's authority while making the princes believe they were receiving independent education and socialization. These young men grew up genuinely loving Wu as a mother figure, never realizing that their emotions had been systematically engineered through years of psychological manipulation. They would compete for her attention and approval, viewing her favor as the greatest possible reward and her displeasure as the most devastating punishment imaginable. When Emperor Gaozong finally died in 683 CE, Wu's control over the imperial succession was so complete that the transition occurred without significant opposition. The designated heir, Emperor Zhongzong, was one of Wu's psychologically conditioned stepsons, who genuinely believed that sharing power with her was the natural order of things. But Wu's appetite for control had grown beyond the bounds of traditional imperial authority. She didn't want to rule through a puppet emperor. She wanted to rule as emperor herself, something that violated every precedent in Chinese history. Her solution was to orchestrate what appeared to be a popular movement, demanding that she assume direct imperial authority. Using the networks of influence she had built over decades, Wu convinced key officials that the empire required her direct leadership to address various crises that she had secretly created. Regional rebellions that she had fomented through careful manipulation were presented as evidence that only her strong hand could restore order. Economic problems that resulted from policies she had influenced were portrayed as proof that traditional male leadership was inadequate. The psychological manipulation involved in this campaign was breathtaking in its scope and sophistication. Wu managed to convince a significant portion of the Chinese elite that placing a woman on the dragon throne was not just acceptable, but necessary for the empire's survival. She had rewritten the fundamental assumptions of Chinese political culture through pure force of psychological will. In 690 CE, Wu Zetian formally declared herself emperor, founding the short-lived Zhou dynasty that would last until her death in 705 CE. But her reign as emperor was merely the culmination of a lifetime spent perfecting techniques of psychological control that would influence Chinese imperial practice for centuries to come. As Emperor Wu, she continued refining her methods of invisible governance, creating systems of administration so subtle that her subjects often felt they were participating in their own governance, rather than being controlled by imperial authority. Her court became a laboratory for experiments in human psychology that pushed the boundaries of what was possible through pure manipulation of human consciousness. But Wu's greatest legacy wasn't her temporary seizure of the dragon throne. It was her demonstration that imperial power could be exercised through psychological control so complete that subjects would celebrate their own oppression as liberation. She had solved the fundamental problem of tyranny: how to make people want to be enslaved. The techniques she developed would be studied and refined by subsequent dynasties, each building upon her insights into human psychology to create ever more sophisticated systems of mental and emotional control. The dragon throne had evolved from a seat of arbitrary power into something far more sinister. A position that came with detailed knowledge of how to reshape human consciousness itself according to imperial specifications. As Wu Zetian's reign drew to a close, the stage was set for the final and most disturbing phase of Chinese imperial development. Her successors would inherit not just her innovations in psychological control, but also the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 years of experimentation in human suffering. The worst horrors were yet to come, as future emperors would combine Wu's subtle manipulations with the crude brutalities of their predecessors to create systems of oppression so complete that their subjects would forget that freedom had ever been possible. The dragon throne awaited its next occupant, and with each succession, the darkness would only deepen until the very concept of resistance became not just dangerous, but psychologically impossible. In the golden halls of the Forbidden City, surrounded by gardens where beauty bloomed over the graves of human dignity, the sons of heaven would continue their eternal experiment in the transformation of human souls, secure in their divine mandate to rule over subjects who had been engineered to worship their own destruction. And so, dear listener, as our journey through these shadowed corridors of ancient power draws to its close, we're left to contemplate the terrible legacy of absolute authority, unchecked by conscience or consequence. The emperors we've encountered tonight weren't monsters born from legend or nightmare. They were human beings who discovered that unlimited power inevitably corrupts the soul, transforming even the most promising individuals into architects of unimaginable suffering. From Qin Shi Huang's brutal unification to Wu Zetian's psychological manipulations, we've witnessed how each dynasty built upon the cruelties of its predecessors, refining techniques of oppression until they achieved a terrible perfection. These weren't random acts of violence, but systematic innovations in human misery that would echo through centuries of Chinese history. The Dragon Throne became more than a seat of power. It was a machine for corrupting souls, a position that came with detailed instruction manuals written in blood and suffering. Each emperor who claimed it inherited not just authority over millions of lives, but the accumulated wisdom of generations who had learned to transform human beings into instruments of their will. Perhaps most chilling of all is how these ancient techniques of control continue to whisper through the corridors of power even today. The methods may have evolved, the technology may have advanced, but the fundamental human vulnerabilities that these emperors exploited remain unchanged. The desire for security, the need for belonging, the fear of isolation. These are the eternal weaknesses that tyrants throughout history have learned to manipulate. As you drift off to sleep tonight, secure in your comfortable bed, remember that the freedom you enjoy was purchased with the suffering of countless souls who lived and died under the weight of absolute power. The soft pillow beneath your head, the gentle darkness that surrounds you. These simple comforts would have seemed like impossible luxuries to the millions who lived in terror of their divine ruler's whims. But perhaps there's hope to be found in this dark history. For in telling these stories, in remembering these horrors, we ensure that the voices of the oppressed are not silenced by time. Every emperor who believed he had achieved immortality through his monuments and conquests has crumbled to dust, while the memory of those who suffered under their rule continues to speak across the centuries. The sons of heaven claimed divine authority, but in the end, they were revealed to be nothing more than mortal men whose hunger for power consumed not just their subjects, but their own humanity. Their golden palaces have fallen, their elaborate tombs have been plundered, and their names are remembered, not with reverence, but as warnings of what happens when power is divorced from compassion. So rest easy tonight, dear friend, knowing that even the mightiest tyrants are ultimately powerless against the passage of time and the judgment of history. The darkness we've explored together serves as a reminder of how precious our freedoms truly are, and how vigilant we must remain to protect them from those who would sacrifice human dignity on the altar of absolute power. Sweet dreams, and may your sleep be peaceful, knowing that the age of the Dragon Throne has passed into history, leaving behind only cautionary tales and the eternal reminder that power without conscience inevitably devours itself.